Tells the people, okay, we're going to do it. Then Moses writes down everything. And then he says, now here's the book of the covenant. I mean, it's quite clear. It's quite plain. I hate to be so redundant, but it's that plain in the text. So what do some of the rabbis say? Ancient rabbis, Moses then wrote down everything the Lord had said. Oh, but he didn't write down the oral law because that's forbidden. Also, he didn't write down Martian documents. Also, he did not write down the constitution of the planet of Pluto. It says what it says. Once you want to start imagining what he didn't write down, might as well put anything. I mean, you kind of sigh when the texts that have a tie for the oral law are the ones that say, write it down. And where it says, write it, they wrote down everything. Oh, yeah, but what he didn't write down was the oral law. There was no oral law to write. Everything God said, Moses told the people. The people said, we'll do it. Moses then wrote it all down, said, here's the book of the covenant. So these references I gave, like Exodus 34:27, this is an alleged hint of the oral Torah in the written. There are no explicit or implicit references to the oral Torah within the written. If it was so important, God should have said it. You know, we're asked the question, well, where is Jesus in the Torah? Well, of course, the Torah itself doesn't say much about the traditional Jewish Messiah either. Sometimes Genesis 49:10 is taken as a reference. Numbers 24 is taken as a reference. But we have him prefigured in the sacrificial system. We have him prefigured in the high priestly ministry. We have the atoning work of the high priest. We have the death of the high priest releasing the manslayer, along with the promises to Judah. We have other prefigurings. We have the reference to Deuteronomy 18 to listen to the prophet that's raised up in each generation, Yeshua being the last and the greatest of those prophets, and we dare not ignore his words. He's clearly prefigured. The oral law is not mentioned. Number 3, throughout biblical history, not only was there no evidence of an authoritative oral Torah, but at times there was gross ignorance of the written Torah. Could you imagine that I'm going to tell you that there are people who couldn't even count from 1 to 20, who didn't even have the ability to say 2 plus 2 is 4, but they were devising the most brilliant calculus theories in the history of mathematics? Be a little far-fetched. No, they can't even write the letters A through Z in English. They don't know the difference between a noun and a verb. If you quiz them on vocabulary, they can only get 100 words right. However, they are writing the most brilliant scholarly analyses of the English language and history. No, it's a completely impossible scenario. As you read through the Hebrew Scriptures, you have periods of gross ignorance. You have periods where they're not observing just the most basic holy days on any national level for generations. You have them worshiping idols and having homosexual prostitutes in the temple. Not long after Hezekiah cleanses it, you have all this stuff going on. You have the people in Jeremiah's day, after the destruction of Jerusalem, exiled where they fled in Egypt, arguing with the prophet that the reason this happened to us is because we stopped worshiping the Queen of Heaven. When we went along with all your reforms and Josiah's reforms, that's when everything went wrong for us. You even have in Josiah's day in 2 Kings 22 that gross ignorance of fundamental things written in the Torah. They rediscover the Torah. And according to no less an authority than Rabbi David Kimche, one of the 3 great medieval Jewish commentators, during the days of Manasseh, all the Torah scrolls were destroyed. You have many times in Israelite history gross ignorance of the written Torah, and yet allegedly this massive oral traditions being passed on, this massive, complex, detailed, difficult oral traditions being passed on through the generations. Well, they don't even have the basics of Torah law right. And often there's ignorance of it on a national level. I could expand on that, but I think that's self-evidently clear. Number 4, contrary to many rabbinic traditions, Moses did not receive every detail of the oral law on Mount Sinai. Some rabbinic traditions claim he received all the oral law. Some claim that he received the understanding by which all the oral law could be interpreted. Some rabbinic traditions that say that when Moses died, that thousands and thousands of laws were lost, and then Joshua and the others had to try to study to reconstruct them, etc. But we have 4 different times, as referenced in your study guide, 4 different times in the Torah where Moses doesn't know what to do in a certain situation. So he goes and asks God. Like Numbers 15 with a Sabbath breaker. You say, well, how do we know for a fact that, because he was gathering wood on the Sabbath, he was worthy of death penalty, he was breaking the law? Well, again, he was brought in for doing it. It was obviously self-evident. If we had more details and information, we would understand exactly why he was breaking the law. But the question is, okay, it says death penalty. Does it specify what kind of death penalty in the text, whatever the reason is? Or should he be put to death? Was this actually a violation of Sabbath? What does Moses do? He goes and asks the Lord, and the Lord tells him. Some rabbis claim, well, he didn't know which manner of death penalty. Fine, then he didn't get the whole oral law. This happens 4 times where he doesn't know what to do in a given case, so he goes and asks God. Some rabbinic traditions say, well, he was just being an example of humility. I mean, I really know the answer, but I'll go and ask God anyway. Point of fact, he went and asked because he didn't have the answer. And God gave him the answer. Why? Because he didn't receive an oral interpretation for everything, and cases would come up whereby people would have to go to God. Just like in Zechariah's day, the people come to Zechariah with a question, a legal question, and he goes and asks God. And that's also why you had the courts, and people would work things out. And then if it was too difficult, then ultimately they'd go to the court of referral mentioned in Deuteronomy 17. And then if people got off track or other things like in Jeremiah's day, he brings a word to them about carrying loads on the Sabbath, etc. This is how the whole thing functioned. So contrary to many rabbinic traditions, Moses did not receive every detail of the oral law on Sinai. Now look, you can try to make something work and tie yourself into a spiritual, theological, and intellectual pretzel to try to make everything work itself out. And you could say, you know, the evidence is actually against this whole oral law thing. The explicit evidence is actually against it. Number 5, the rabbinic writings at times completely violate or twist the plain meaning of the scriptures, making clear that they cannot represent a valid tradition dating back to Moses. They at times completely violate or twist the plain meaning of the scriptures, making clear that they cannot represent a valid tradition dating back to Moses. I'm not just talking about a midrashic or a homiletical interpretation, which is a play on words, which does not carry legal authority, which is not meant to give the plain sense. I'm talking about at times when laws are based on misreadings of the text, or major authority is given to the rabbis based on wrong meanings of the text. And I'll give you the classic one. This is the one most commonly pointed to. Exodus 23:2. Do not follow the crowd in doing wrong. When you give testimony in a lawsuit, do not pervert justice by siding with the crowd. The final words in that verse in Hebrew, Achrei Rabim Lahatot, after the many, to turn aside, meaning to turn aside justice or to pervert justice. The root natah